So I've clicked record, and from now on the session is going to be recorded. Anything that happens in the breakout rooms is not recorded, where you will break into small groups and do some learning activities. The first thing I want you to do today is go into some small groups. Oh, well, let's just, talk about the overall agenda today. So today, and over the next 3 weeks, at this time, my university has allowed me to provide these sessions. We're going to cover some different topics in relation to tele-delivery, so a little bit more focused. I'll tell you specifically what they all are at the end of today, but the focus of today is on communication, the way we communicate in, over a telehealth situation. There's a lot of recognition in the group already from last week that we need to be using advanced communication strategies in our telehealth delivery. Communication really matters more than it ever did before. And so I'm going to introduce 2 ideas in thinking about the way that we communicate. I'm going to draw from an overall process for communication that's been suggested, particularly for working with Māori in New Zealand, Māori, the Indigenous people of New Zealand, but it's also just actually a really good overall process called the Hui process as a way for structuring our communication. And we're also going to talk about communication strategies that support behaviour change, support our clients to adopt new ways of doing things or do more of the things that support their well-being. But I'm also extremely aware that there is a huge amount of wisdom in the group. So what I wanted to start with first was an opportunity to share what you have learned already. So your task, first of all, is to go into small groups and discuss what your experience of telehealth has been over this past week. So I want you to particularly think about something that you did that was familiar to you, something that you normally do in your role that felt familiar, and you're going to share this in your small groups. I also want you to think about something that you did that was unfamiliar, that was different, that you tried out, something that you had to do in your work role that was new to you. The familiar, the unfamiliar, and third, I want you to describe what lessons you've learned in the past, over this past week. What's a lesson learned? Now you might want to think about something that you did that you know not to do again. You're going to totally avoid. But I also want you to think about something that you did and you realised that that worked really well. And I'm going to do that again. So I'm just going to pop those instructions into the chat box, which has a nasty little habit of hiding when I am sharing the screen. Please bear with me. Pardon?
If you click on more, you see the chat.
Yeah, I do see that, but it's not coming up. Then the box is not appearing on me because Zoom is probably not coping very well, I think. Okay, so you're just going to have to remember those 3 things. Mindy, the link that you created, could you try and put that in the chat box? You see if that will work? So something that was familiar, something unfamiliar, and lessons learned. Do or don't do in the future. You're going to discuss that in small groups in just a moment. We've created a little online place where you can enter this information. The system is called airtable.com, and it's the kind of tool you might consider using in your clinical work for different types of purposes. So you can click on that link and enter in your responses. If you're feeling maxed out with the technology already, don't worry about it. No requirement to do it. It's not research. It won't go anywhere else. What we will do after the discussion is we'll share that as a board where everybody can see it. So click that link. Now, when you click that link, into Airtable, it will mean that your picture of your group gets hidden behind other layers, because that website's going to come and sit on the top page of your screen. So if you just go into your control panel at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to find the Zoom meeting again if you want to see them again. All of this is entirely voluntary, of course. So I'm going to just stop share for a moment. And there's the chat box that I was missing. Thanks, Mindy. And I'm going to put you into randomly allocated breakout rooms. So I'm going to assign you to groups of, how's my quick maths? Oops. Oh well, it's done now. No, I'm not going to recreate because I see when I want less people in the rooms than that. Okay. And all rooms are now open. So you get a link appearing on your screen inviting you to the room. When you click it, you'll find yourself in a smaller group with half a dozen people to now work through that sharing exercise. We'll take about 7 minutes or so to do that. I'll see you all back here soon. Here's people coming in late. Hi to those who have just joined us. So resuming recording now, going through the WHOI process. So it's a really good overall process for structuring a healthcare conversation. So I won't worry too much about the Māori translations of it, and we'll stick with the English today. But what it essentially does is formalise that process of conversation, so that all bases are covered. Now it's really easy to think that we do each of these things, and but it's really easy to not do it. So first up, a really key factor about the WHOI process is it's a two-way process. So we go through each of these steps, but we also, as the healthcare provider, invite the client to take part in each of those steps as well. So first step, introducing yourself. Now that sounds like a no-brainer, right? And I'm sure you learnt it in your 101 communication lesson for your profession. But it's remarkably common and how frequently health professionals forget to introduce themselves. So telehealth, we've got no context. You didn't walk into my clinic. You didn't walk into the hospital where I work. And I haven't turned up at your house in my uniform. So all of that stuff about introduction becomes really, really essential. So asking, introducing yourself, saying what your name is, what your role is, and checking in, inviting your client to introduce themselves, checking in what their name is, what name do they prefer to be referred to, as a way of starting to build that rapport very quickly and intentionally with language when you don't have all of the other non-verbal cues to go by. You might want to discuss who made the referral, what it is that brought you there today. Do they remember know who that was, in fact? And yeah, so that sense of that introduction. Remember, that's a two-way process. So if you're thinking about a checklist, if you're a bit nervous about the start of the use of technology, these are the kinds of things that might be useful to remember to do as the introductory checklist before you get into the kaupapa, the main business of what you're there to do, which is often where most health professionals, where many health professionals would jump straight in. Now, the second step, whakawhanaungatanga, is about making connection. And this is a bit that is particularly derived from the Māori process of greeting. But many people, once they've learnt this, talk about using these ways of formally building connection with the client to enhance the therapeutic relationship. So what it does is it ramps up the rate at which trust is developed in that relationship. Obviously, for some clients that's going to be hard and slow, and they're going to remain wary because of their other life experiences and experiences of health professionals, but it's going to make it, making a conscious effort to make a connection with that person as another human being it's going to go better than it would otherwise. So making a connection using the Hui process, again, it's a two-way process. So it's about making a comment or asking a question that relates to something about the person that's not the health concern or the health issue that's been raised. What it's signaling to the client is that I'm interested in you as a whole person. I know there's more to you than your bunged up knee. And that's a really powerful signal to people. And often one of the most frequent criticisms about health professionals is they didn't, they were only interested in my hand or my knee or my pathology and not about me as a person, thinking about the other things going on in my lives. And of course, many of us do, but in some ways the whole sort of professionalization process and the time pressures that we're often working under lead us to engage really discreetly about the impairment or the health issue that's been raised. So I notice you as an individual. I know that there's more things going on in your life. And so how might you do that? And so, for example, I'm having this let's say I'm having this telehealth consultation with Caro, and I can see Caro sitting on a beautiful veranda, and she's got some gorgeous bush going on there in the background. So hi Caro, I'm Fee Graham from the University of Otago here. I'm teaching telehealth rehabilitation. How are you today?
Hi Fee, I'm very well, thank you. Just we've got so much competition for Zoom meetings in our household that I actually got booted onto the deck because my two daughters are both one studying at Otago and the other one is an occupational therapist, and I was panicking about actually getting connected to my modem, so I fiddled with it and blew everybody's Zoom session, just so that you know how telehealth is going in our household.
Oh, well done, Caro, coming out chumps this time. I think if I was at your house, I'd be going for that spot there myself. I love sitting around a bit of bush and some lovely trees. So Caro, in that example, she was like a classic kind of therapist person. I have no idea what Caro's work role is, but let's say she's an allied health practitioner where often people, we like to share, we like to talk. So she gave us lots of information that I could give her the opportunity to share. And what did I learn about her? She's living in a really complex household at the moment, particularly in light of doing telehealth delivery. Good to know. Now, the other thing that you might have noticed that I did was I disclosed something about myself. I shared, which is a key part of the Hui process in the whakawhanangatanga, making connection. Now that's something we're often taught not to do explicitly sometimes as health professionals. But from a Māori perspective, if people don't share anything about themselves, then the listener or the client is left not knowing, is a little guarded perhaps, sorry. And so disclosing a little bit of something about myself, I really like nature too. It gives something to Caro for her to start to get to know me as a person. And so she will likely reciprocate that as well. So that's a really big challenge. Now, how can you do that? And that's in that way that I did it. I didn't tell her the school my children go to or what my home address was or where I grew up, or I might have done any of those things if I felt really comfortable with it. But for many reasons, we won't feel comfortable doing that sort of thing with our clients. So thinking about what could you disclose about your client as a way to engage. I'm going to try to get you to practice this in small groups in a few minutes. So, that's a lovely pair of earrings you have on. Are they special to you? Oh, I know, I hear you live in Whangarei. I'd love to go there one day. I've heard it's really beautiful. So things like that, there no harm in me sharing that information, sharing my perspective on things. It's positive, and it's showing that I recognise there's a bigger picture of you. You are bigger than your health condition, and the resources to manage your health condition lie in those things that are about you that are bigger than your health condition. So the next stage, the kaupapa or mahi, the main business that we hear about. This is why you refer to a pediatric OT or a musculoskeletal physio. And this is what we the agenda that we're going to talk about today in this telehealth consultation. What are we going to cover? What's the main concern that we're going to cover? And how are we going to explore that? I might ask you to show a couple of positions, body positions to me. Might ask you to do a couple of actions so I can get a sense of what's going on for you. If you're okay with it, for example, Joanna, Calandra, if you're okay with it as my client, I might ask you to be able to just move your camera around to be able to show me some of the environment that you're trying to work in. Is that going to be okay for you today? Would that feel useful? So that's what we're talking about that kaupapa, that main discussion, and then kind of get on with doing that remote wheelchair assessment or consultation with the parent of a child with developmental disabilities, or whatever it is that our particular role is. Hope you're taking good notes. You're going to be doing this again in small groups in just a moment, but you can phone a friend in your group to be able to help you out with how to do that. And finally, the poroporaki is that closing, that wrapping up. Our session has come to a close now, and I just want to check with you, is that, do you have any questions about what we've covered today? The next thing that's going to be happening is I'm going to make a referral to blah, blah. I'm going to phone in with you again next Tuesday to see how things have been working out, how those ideas have worked out for you, and how we can take them further. What is the next steps from your perspective that you're planning to do as a client? And again, we often, in our Pakeha kind of Western way, it's easy to leave that sort of stuff at an untidy end. And especially when we're working in a novel environment that we're maybe a little bit uncomfortable about and ending up with quite an abrupt finishing. So there we go. That's an overall process for thinking about structuring your telehealth. And for some of us, it might just be about putting a little bit more in at the beginning, at the end, that then we wouldn't normally formally do. The other thing is you've probably got your usual pattern for how you do things if you've been working in your area for a while. And what you're missing in the telehealth, what we're all missing in this telehealth situation, is all those subtle cues that remind us to say that thing, or that thing that we often move into after we take our shoes off and walk into somebody's house. And just the fact that we don't have those cues, and we're having to stare at a picture of ourselves while we are talking with our client can kind of throw us. So putting some structure around that conversation can sometimes be really helpful. So Mindy, are we all set to go with some breakout rooms?
See, I can't do breakout rooms with the questions you've given me, sorry.
Okay. Co-host does not get breakout. Recreate rooms, and this time let's try and bring it down to 20 rooms, which is still quite a lot. Let's see how it goes. If it's not working out, I'll send out a memo. You'll get an alert saying end breakout rooms, and if you could come back as soon as possible because everybody's sitting and waiting. But if you don't hear from me in the next couple of minutes, you know it's gone okay. So you've got a message now to join the breakout rooms. If you get bumped out of the video conference, just jump back in again. Examples, while I was chatting earlier, there was a nice set of examples in the chat box about how people handle that aspect of it, that way, or different ways of building connection that don't over disclose about you and turn the conversation into being all about me as the healthcare provider. Keep the focus on the client and their experience, but fast and discreet. So any other good ideas or good examples that you heard in your small groups, for those who managed to make them work, pop them into the chat box, and we can put a summary of those up on our Facebook page, which is available on the first and last slides, as a way to sort of access that later on. Feel free to make notes as you go as well. Okay, so moving on. I wanted to introduce another couple of ideas now within that, within the hui process, where it comes to the kaupapa, the main business of why we are having this health session together, that support behaviour change in particular, and demonstrating why listening is often more powerful way to support people to make change than telling. We're all pretty good at telling, oriented to telling as health professionals. So I want to do this very, very simply. There are a lot of different frameworks, and I know that most people aren't that interested in frameworks as much as academics are, but I'm just going to share this idea here. Now, this will be really, really familiar to some of you, and just enough new stuff for others, hopefully. So I'm just going to share this idea of self-determination theory. The authors are Deci and Ryan from the 1980s, and talk about it as a way for understanding people's motivation. Because when we think about people's motivation to take action from some of this idea of self-determination, it gives us a lot more, I was going to say levers to pull, but it's not quite the right metaphor, because it's about, really the essence is giving control to the client rather than being in so much control ourselves as the health professional. That makes a big difference to people actually doing something differently. So self-determination theory suggests that people's motivation moves along this continuum from being unmotivated, here's my button, from being unmotivated, completely amotivated, through to being super motivated, the kind of person that climbs mountains and whatever the mountain is in your life. So motivation is a very fluid thing. So when you think about the terms adherence or compliance, those somewhat ugly words that are used quite a lot within healthcare and rehabilitation, that's all about people doing what we, as the health professional, feel they should be doing. But when we can flip that into identifying and exploring what the client wants to be able to do and what they perceive are the barriers, then people engage very differently in taking actions. Deci and Ryan suggest that these three basic psychological needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence are instrumental in explaining a person's motivation to do something differently. And we can, as the healthcare provider, in any conversation we have, we meet those basic psychological needs to a greater or lesser extent. And the better we are at meeting them, the more likely somebody is to do something differently. So very briefly, the way that we meet the need for relatedness is strong, positive connection. So going back to the hui process that we just talked about a moment ago, it's about pausing in our work and intentionally building connection. Just doing that, if we're not used to doing that already, will make a huge difference to people's willingness to engage with us, connect with us, and share with us what's really going on in their lives. We support their need for competence quite a lot by simply providing structure to the learning process that they're going to. Now we can start by thinking about structure within the immediate session that we are doing. Again, thinking about the hui process or whatever your version of that is, that makes it really clear what's happening, and autonomy, sharing power, offering choice and control. So in terms of relatedness, the client needs to have that experience of being respected. So it's not that, well, of course I respect my clients. The point is that the client feels respected. And what it takes for that client to feel respected is going to be really different for different clients, right? Because we all bring our baggage to any kind of encounter. And if I've had a negative experience with somebody who looks gorgeous and young and white and intelligent and attractive, then like you maybe, then they're going to take a lot more work for you in this encounter, and it's nothing to do with you. And feeling understood, feeling like you understand my situation. Now, if I think back to the health worker that rang me about the issue with my son a couple of days ago, I felt respected by her. I didn't feel particularly understood. I suppose I felt a little bit disrespected because she cut me off a couple of times when I was just trying to share that little bit more about myself that just felt natural for me to share. She thought she was being a really hard worker, getting right down to business. But for me, in terms of building that relationship with her and what I feel will feel like disclosing in future, she's not going to get much detail from me going forward. She's going to get a lot less than she would have otherwise. And finally, around connection, we want people to feel like they can trust me. Now, unfortunately, this can be used for good or evil. I won't name any names around the world now or in the past, but you see how when people have that sense of feeling that they can trust somebody, and often that comes from a response of empathy from the healthcare provider, then they get the feeling of, this is somebody I can trust. So I'll tell her what's really going on. So if, things get pretty rough with me and my son with this toileting issue, and I end up doing some unsophisticated parenting with my child in order to get him to go to the toilet in moments of frustration, if that was what was going on, I won't be telling that to this healthcare provider that took a very therapist-directed approach with me the other day and showed that she wasn't interested in hearing the wider picture beyond her immediate agenda. In terms of competence, there's two really key things about competence: a person's sense of competence influencing what they're going to do, their motivation to do something differently. The first thing is that they believe that they can do it. They believe that they're competent to use the strategy, and that they actually are competent to do it. So we need to ask ourselves really closely as the health professional, here in this telehealth environment, the mechanism for change is always going to be the client, either the parent of a child or the wife of the husband sitting in the armchair with a stroke, or the client themselves. But it's not going to be us as the health professional with our hands on the person or anything else that we would normally do. The only thing we've got going for us is our ability to communicate really clearly. So some people might believe they can do it, but actually they can't. And other people might be actually really competent, but not believe that they are. Now, both of those situations are going to influence the person's motivation to act. It's going to look like they're not very motivated about this. I thought we talked about this and established that this was a really good idea, and yet I come back next week and they haven't done it. Now, there will be a reason for that, and the self-determination theory is a really useful one for unpacking what some of those reasons might be. And finally, around sharing and autonomy, enhancing a person's sense of autonomy. And a really key way we do that is the autonomy is their sense of that they're living the life they want to have in this health regard, that they're the agent of change in their own lives. Now, a key instrument for doing this in healthcare is the use of goals that are personally meaningful to the client. And so that is where we would need to park the idea of having our therapist-driven goals, or the idea that, the kind of clients that I work with, they're just not very good about setting goals, and they don't really understand enough about child development or the health condition, so I tend to set the goals for them. So that type of approach does not feed into elevating a person's sense of autonomy. In fact, it corrodes their autonomy if we decide that, or we run the conversation in a way that it appears that we know more about what is important to them than what they do. The skillfulness is in how we ask questions to guide them to identify what their goals are. Some clients, that'll be really easy, and some clients, this will be a completely foreign language and a culturally unknown concept of setting goals, and that's our challenge, is to usually ask questions to help them to explore it. And finally, around supporting autonomy is providing opportunities for choice. In whatever moment they were in this healthcare conversation, how can I offer choice to the client? How could I pose a question so that the client is choosing between, at the very minimum, 2 options? Or for the client that is more competent or cognitively, or where be at a more reflective stage of the conversation, an open-ended question where they can be making a choice, making a decision. So in this healthcare telehealth encounter I had with this public health nurse the other day around my son, not a lot of opportunities for choice in that encounter. She was absolutely in control of the way that that conversation was going to go. She had her script and she went through her script, and I was at the receiving end of it. Now, in terms of motivation to experiment, explore, do things differently, she didn't create that kind of opportunity for me. So by and large, I'm left in much the same situation as I was before she made that phone call. So some opportunities lost there with that lady. So take-home message: ask first. That's where for all of those dimensions of self-determination, meeting all of those 3 psychological needs, your number 1 strategy is to ask a question. Ask first rather than tell, because when we're asking first, we're putting the client in the position of self-determining the direction that their health journey is going to take next. And when people are self-determining, they're more likely to practice more often, they're more likely to strive harder, and they're more likely to persist when things are difficult. We know really clearly from the research that when we tell people what to do, they very seldom do it. Ask any musculoskeletal physio who's been dishing out exercise programs. Think of the last set of health information that you were given. You either probably already knew it and so you didn't need that information, or you would have modified that idea and turned it into your own. This is what most people do when they're provided information. Now, you are experts, right? You have a lot of expertise, and the place, there is obviously a place for the health condition specific information that you have. But the key thing is to find out what the client thinks is going on and what they think will help. Some people use the term coaching to describe this style of working. It's very different, isn't it, from training or teaching. What I'm doing right now is teaching, right? I'm imparting information. It's a pretty one-way exchange. Coaching is when you spend most of your time asking questions and eliciting what the client thinks is a useful thing to do, what they think is important in the next step, and how they are analysing the situation. And that is really critical for behaviour change, because the behaviours, the actions they take, are highly dependent on what they already know and what they already think about the situation. Now, the time that our general health and disability knowledge is really useful and will influence behaviour change is when that thing that we know, that very specialist thing that we know about people, moving, developing atypically because of their health condition, when they have a really clear and specific knowledge gap about that, that is when our information will help to shift behaviour and health related choices that somebody makes. And that is a fraction of the time that we typically think it is. Very seldom do they need new information where it comes to making a choice about doing things differently in their lives. So the other point there is the person that is going to feel more autonomous, more competent, and more like a good, likable, respected person is the person doing the talking rather than the person doing the listening. Don't know if you've ever heard that adage that the person that learns the most quite often is the teacher, the person that's in that teaching role. And that you might have had a similar experience like that in those small groups a moment ago. So we want the client to be the person doing the talking, the person doing the thinking and the analysis most of the time, because that's going to support their motivation to change. Now, in terms of that piece that is your expertise, this is one suggestion. This is used within some coaching literature, some solution-focused therapy literature, and some aspects of motivational interviewing. In terms of the way of sharing information with people that supports people to remain, the client to remain in that high autonomy, high competence state. Because when we do impart some information, this is a vulnerable point for dropping somebody's motivation, because when we're sharing information, the other person goes into a more passive role. Like just now, right? How long have I been talking for solidly? 20 minutes. And you've been sitting there trying to focus your attention, dozing off, enjoying the birds outside the window, or whatever it is that you're doing. So you're only going to keep listening to me while the information fills a knowledge gap that you have and links to what you see as being really important to know right now. So here's some suggestions of how it could be applied. If you want to access this resource to use it, it is available at the website there. So the first step is to ask permission. We call it the info club. I've coined this phrase, the info club sandwich. So our expert information is sandwiched between asking permission to share that information and then exploring how it would be applied. Now, in both step 1 and step 3, we're handing agency, authority to the client, giving it away. That's where that share term comes from within the application of self-determination theory. So asking permission. Would you be interested to hear about some strategies that other people have found useful with this type of problem? With your permission, I'd like to share a couple of ideas with you. So you're giving them an opportunity to reject you, and being really open to that rejection is really critical. So run it through in your mind beforehand if you're not used to doing that, and sit with it. What does that feel like to get rejected? Oh, they didn't want to hear my ideas. How might you respond next if that does happen? Now, if that feels like, you know, a new pair of jeans when you first do it, usually kind of a bit uncomfortable, takes a while to break in and get comfortable. But the more you do it, the more comfortable it becomes. Sometimes it's implicit in the way that the conversation has gone. But I just encourage you to be a little cautious about assuming that you have permission, especially with a new client. Even just the act of asking permission does give them an opportunity for choice and control, which, as I said before, is really useful in elevating motivation. When you do share information, keep it really short, keep it very goal specific. If you find yourself going into this sort of very long patter that you've done a million times before, it's like, how tailored is that to this individual person's situation? And again, when you've shared your information, and then you kind of invite rejection of that information, if you like. But given what I've just described, does that feel like it fits for this situation? Does this feel useful to you? Does this feel useful to you? Some IT guy somewhere in the bowels of the university is trying to control my computer. Go away, stop, Vic, Vern, whoever you are. Here we go. Keep it short, keep it goal specific, invite rejection, and invite through questioning, how could you apply this information? Could this be useful for you? If it was true, what sort of types of strategies are then likely to work? Do you think? So again, handing that agency back to the client. And if you, step 3 is probably the most critical of all of those steps. So as we have gone through that really rapid rundown of the information, I want you to think about what would that look like for you? If any of those ideas are unfamiliar to you, it's unreasonable to expect that you're going to do that off the hook without any practice in the next healthcare encounter that you had. If you think about your own needs for a sense of competence around trying out some of those ideas, how could you create a practice environment that made that easier to do, where you're more likely to feel successful? Is there somebody that you could practice with? Would it help to write down some of the ideas? What are other ways that you could make that a bite-sized change to make in the way that you deliver your work in a telehealth environment? Now for the next, that's the close of today's session. For the next 3 sessions coming up, here are my suggested topics. Please do pop us up an idea on the chat box now if you've got another idea that you think might be useful or that would fit in with any of those really broad topics. I've kept it at a pretty high level in that I'm aware that most of the people listening in or joining, watching these videos are people that are fairly new to telehealth. And so, yeah, we're just giving overarching ideas. So the next session we'll be thinking about that, the kaupapa, that the main business of your work, where you would normally have taken a hands-on approach, done some sort of hands-on activity, and creative ways about how you might gain the information that you need through telehealth. Session 4 on the 15th, the use of doing group work, so running our education groups or Pilates group or whatever type of group you do, doing that over telehealth. And finally, measuring outcomes by teledelivery and advanced technology ideas. Mindy Silva, who's been an awesome assistant for me today, who's here today, she's currently doing her PhD looking at the use of technologies to support home program implementation in the pediatric field, and she's got a wide range of ideas there of things that are very practical to use and can augment the way that we do our work. So thank you very much for joining us. Thanks you for your patience with the technology breakout room.